we've been working with the department on our Delta Plan language on bypass also, and everybody's in favor of a general proposition, but the actual implementation of it is not easy. But my impression is if we delay on starting to implement flood bypasses, the property, substantial pieces of it, will be converted into some use that will essentially block floodplain development. You have a loose recommendation in here about no development in floodplain, but without, I couldn't find any.
We talked about ag easements.
I understand. But you also talk about ag use that's subject to easements for flooding and inappropriate uses, which is fine. Last, just a technical question. I want to make sure I understand. On page 3-24 on your plan, this is where you talk about considerations for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which is predominantly, not exclusively, outside your area. And you reference section 3.5.9. There isn't any section 3.5.9. Do you mean 7? Did I just, or I think that's what you meant, but if there's some secret addition, I didn't see it.
Yeah, it should be the
7, you think?
The 3 point. I would just look at the whole 3.5. Actually, the larger section there, because. Well, but I mean, that's a good catch. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are things in there, but I couldn't piece them together as directly San Joaquin, Sacramento Delta specific, and it very much. So, just a note. Maybe you could just ship us a letter on amplification of what elements you think fit in there from this chapter. That would be appreciated.
Yeah, we'll definitely compose that letter.
Thank you. Okay.
Mr. Chair, I just want to give some context here, and then I'd like to actually give Mike time to move back to his presentation. I've been involved in a flood control project. Actually, the Santa Ana River at one time was called the most at risk of flooding west of the Mississippi. And we actually suffered in that region major floods in 1967. And it took us about 40 years to get through the entire process. Funding from the state was hard to come by, I know, because I helped try and get some of it from time to time. The project was different because the state was not in the lead. The state legislature has only taken the lead, really, for the Sacramento and San Joaquin, and so for the Central Valley. But it was the same in that in the end, the region had to come together, figure out a plan, and it was a fairly big plan. I mean, we built a dam, we raised another dam, we did all kinds of improvements up and down the entire watershed. But this kind of work will cost many billions of dollars. It cost us many billions of dollars. Engendered many fights. There were times when there were disputes amongst parties about what should be built, and that delayed things for years. And ultimately, though, we got it done because there was kind of this grand vision, and the community came together and got it done. My belief is this plan can get us over that hump to where people start working. They will have big fights. Not everybody's going to like the floodplains they proposed, and I won't be surprised at all if things like that get delayed for 10 years or 15 years while somebody's fighting and saying you should build it here, not here. But in the end, if there's a commitment, we actually raised the money and didn't get our state share, which in our case was maybe 10%, for many, many years. But we wanted to get the project done, so we fronted the money so we could get it done to protect the citizens. And I think this is a good start. Anyway, sorry to.
Okay. Ms. Gray.
I have a question for Joe. Or maybe
pull it closer to you.
It's on, I think.
It's on. I have a question. I know the Central Valley Protection Plan only addresses a third of the levees, correct?
In the Delta.
In the Delta,
In the
correct?
Delta.
Yeah, and so I guess my question would be, where would we get the information relative to the others?
Well, that's the next item on the
Is that
agenda. We're going
economic
to talk
sustain-
some about that, and we're going to have it at a meeting after this. But there isn't, for the Delta itself, anything as well thought through and coordinated as even this study.
Yeah. The economic sustainability study that we're going to hear next, it covers the entire Delta levee system, correct?
It does.
Okay.
They're
So
gonna
the
talk about
report
it all.
from Central Valley, how does that interact or compare to the information we're going to receive later?
So I've reviewed some of the earlier drafts of the Delta Protection Commission's Economic Sustainability Plan, but by and large, they're somewhat independent in their nature. The interaction I would characterize as when we went through and developed the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, which we've been doing for 3 years, we had 5 regional working groups. One that was focused in the Delta, so a number of the participants who have been informing the Delta Protection Commission's Economic Sustainability Plan were also providing some feedback to us in the development of Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. So we really relied on the interactions between agency to agency and the stakeholder interactions between the two groups to be those cross-linkages. But the timetables between the two plans didn't really permit a pause. And the caveat I put out there is the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan in SB 5 had a legislative mandate that was actually fairly difficult to meet in the standpoint that we had to go through, collect the information for literally what is the state plan of flood control? What are these levees? We had to find out what were orphans that were forgotten about at some point in time because an engineer left it off a map or a paper got misfiled. We had to collect that information. So that was the early phase. Then we had to go through and do geotechnical evaluations that resulted in the flood control system status report that Phil was talking to. I've affectionately referred to it as a document only an engineer could love because it's highly technical in nature. But that document really is our report card. So we found out what we had. We looked at what we had to assess what its current performance is. And then based on that, we worked with stakeholders to talk about what could we do to improve the system, both at that local level, a regional level, and overall throughout the entire system. And so those 3 documents represent a large body of work that isn't really characterized as just a flood control system status report or a descriptive document or a plan, but it represents the thousands of pages that you get from a normal planning document. So the technical appendices that really attach this document that you have here that was really the foundation for the economic justification, just for the economic justification. And this is the hydrology and hydraulics, the performance issues. Those counted, I think, over about 1,600 pages of documents.
So there was some coordination
Yes.
in terms of your report. How does your report address our environmental ecosystem restoration goal? How does that address that?
So in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, the ecosystem components, they're interspersed within the document of the plan itself. And then the first attachment released was a document that's equal length, about 150 pages. It's called the Conservation Framework. That really identifies what are the distinct reach-by-reach areas within the Central Valley where there are opportunities for different habitat types and system benefits really associated with the habitat restoration activity. And the conservation framework is intended to be the guide as we go through and identify future multi-project objectives and what those cost shares would be and what we'd look to. We would look to the conservation framework in the interim, but the conservation framework is going to give birth in 2017 to a larger document called the Conservation Strategy, which would then be that policy or guidance document within the department on how we would incorporate the habitat and ecosystem secondary goals to the plan into flood risk reduction projects.
Okay. And I think you were asked early on by the chairperson, what happens to this report? What does DWR do? Does it become policy? What do we do with it with the council? Can you just kind of restate that, what happens with the report and how it impacts on our decision here?
So one of the teeth that was sitting in SB 5 is that when the board adopts the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan in July of this year, when counties are going through and updating their general plans, they'll have a period of time, and I want to say it's about a year and a half to go through and make sure that when they update their general plan, that update of the general plan is consistent with the concepts that are outlined here and the data that was used in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. So the department has also been providing that data to locals. And then after they've updated their general plans, the local communities have to go through and update their zoning ordinances to be consistent with the plan. So that's one of the sort of the triggers that's sitting out there. So the department is working on additional guidance and documents for the locals, where we have a document called the Urban Level of Protection document that literally is a step-by-step process of how the urban communities, so these are communities of over 10,000 people, would be able to achieve the 200-year level of protection that was put forth in SB 5. Now, SB 5 is actually a hallmark or milestone piece of legislation in the United States, and that it represents the first time that a state government has gone through and required a 200-year level of protection above and beyond FEMA's 100-year level of protection. And the plan sets the tone of how you could go through and get types of improvements to get there. The urban level of protection document that will come out will talk about the process of which you would go through and demonstrate that you have the 200-year level of protection. And the department has also been working with the stakeholder group on a document we call the Urban Level Design Criteria. And this is literally from a technical standpoint of what is 200-year level protection for the levee system. And this gets into really designing new levee standards and criteria out there for the urban areas, with the intent being to reduce the risk. So the plan talked about it here. When we went through and developed our cost estimates for the plan and our features, for the urban areas, we took the design work that was sitting in the urban level design criteria and applied that in there. So as you might imagine, a 200-year urban levee is broader, taller, stronger than a 100-year levee or a rural levee. And so from that standpoint, the costs are higher. And so that information is reflected in the plan.
That was going to be it. So the cost reflects the 200-year protection?
Right, what it would take to achieve that. And then the way we addressed the areas that we didn't cover in the Delta, and I'll get into this later in my PowerPoint presentation, is traditionally when you're going through and developing a flood risk reduction project, the project proponent pencils aside in the project design. So after you finish your recon, your feasibility, and get to the project design, you pencil in what we call a soft cost, your contingency costs. And these include the costs associated with meeting with the stakeholders, the people who you're going to be buying land from, the actual environmental documentation, the permitting requirements. And over time, those soft costs have increased considerably to where today the costs associated with the project, when you get just to the project phase, about 35 to 40% of the costs of an urban project are soft costs, which means you're only spending about 60% of your money actually to put a levee in place or to put a slurry wall to improve it, which is money that could be spent actually providing additional level of protection or additional system-wide benefits. So one of the things that we incorporated into the cost considerations were for an improvement to a state plan of flood control facility, we put in that additional 40% soft cost in there. So there's cost escalation associated with you're going to, and develop with your project, you're going to need to set aside money literally to provide for mitigation for downstream communities. So in the Delta, if you were going through and raising a levee upstream and you were, as part of multiple requirements, a core 408 permit process, a Central Valley Flood Protection Board Title 23 process, or an actual CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act requirement, if through any of those three processes, all of which are required by law, you demonstrated that there was actually a transfer of risk to a downstream community, you would have to mitigate or offset that. That money was actually accounted for in the plan. Now, those numbers are going to be different when you get to the project levels because the project costs will change. But the plan was designed to take into account really what I would consider economic conservatism, and that really plays into effect of when we talk to the system performance of how the water moves and what your baseline conditions are. So those are technical details that are actually in those 1,600 pages of technical appendices. And there was an equal number of pages that informed the conservation framework.
Okay. And I read that some of the information in your report is already reflected in our Chapter 5. Is that right? Not Chapter 5, but fifth draft. 7. So you will, the council will consider the full report and do include it if we think it's feasible or
Yeah,
makes sense.
and the full report is still in a draft form, and the Central Valley Flood Protection Board is actually going to be considering it over the next several months and plans to adopt it by July. So we will probably be bringing that full plan once it's amended, improved, adopted by the flood board to the council and talk about what we ought to be doing and whether we want to incorporate that in or parts of it into the Delta plan beyond what we're already doing.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, sir. Pat, any questions of this? Okay. I've got some questions. I'll hold it. Let you get through your presentation. So. I'm going to hold my questions until I hear the rest of the presentation. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I actually wanted to address one of the chairman's questions. Anna found the number that actually talks about what the annual expected damages are in the no project condition for the plan. If we do nothing today, this is what we would expect on an annual basis to pay out just from damages.
Yeah, so for Sacramento River Basin, without doing anything, the no project condition, we're talking about every year, expected annual damage is $304 million per year for Sacramento. And then for San Joaquin River Basin, we're talking about $25 million per year.
It might be useful getting. Thanks for getting that, Anna. But maybe to provide whatever the excerpts that you've gotten, submit that so we can kind of get a look at what that's based on. And maybe, as you said, it was in the appendices. If I heard you earlier, but
right in this,
yeah.
The specific appendix that's in our plan formulation.
Yeah, it's attachment 8F, so you can find it.
Okay, 8F.
Yeah, in chapter 2.
Okay, thank you.
But we'll provide a letter to follow.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay. Well, I'm still going through the approaches here, so I did want to talk about the other approaches to really provide some important context, because I'm going to get to those again at the end to talk about how those approaches play out in the Delta from a really high level, and also where I think some of the connections are between the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and the Delta Stewardship Council's Delta Plan. So the Protect High-Risk Communities, really what we're talking about doing there is achieving the 200-year level protection levees around the urban areas, and then we've outlined that there are 27 small communities that are at risk of flooding that we would provide 100-year level protection. So the types of improvements that we've talked about putting there for that $9 to $11 billion of cost are literally raising the levees in the urban areas, and then the rural areas, we're talking about providing ring levees around communities or J levees. When you put a ring levee around a community, you really do encapsulate that community. So the communities don't always like that because it limits growth outside of that ring levee. So when you get into the risk reduction issues and questions, putting the ring in there means that there's going to be limited risk intensification from future development near that small community. But it also puts a handicap on that small community's growth and development, and that it's really hard for them to grow outside of that floodplain, which is why some small communities prefer to have, we call it J levee, which is a levee that literally prevents the floodwaters from coming on the low side of that impact area, but the upland areas aren't protected by a levee.
That's great.
Is it 200-year protection for urban areas and 100-year protection for what area?
Small communities. So these would be, in the plan, we have a list of small communities. And then just to put it into context for the Delta here, there were six.
Thank you.
There were 6 small communities that were listed in the Delta, and I'll try and go by memory here, but I'll cheat at my notes here in a second.
I guess my question is, why the difference? I mean,
Oh,
they're both populated.
SB
correct?
5. So the population difference, an urban community has over 10,000 people. A small community is literally a named
Less
place.
people, right?
Yeah, less people.
That was a statutorily imposed
Oh, okay.
limit,
Right.
or definition, rather.
For the urban.
Of course,
Just
I
while
would
we-
think all of it.
Yeah, well, we're on that. I mean, that was one of my questions was going to be, but since you just addressed small communities, some are not listed here. Is that, and they were listed in the legislation, certainly in the Reform Act. May not have been in SB 5, but when I look at the communities of Locke and Freeport and Ryde in Sacramento, but they're not listed amongst your 27, so that means they're not eligible. They don't fall into the criteria. They fall into the even lesser category, and maybe there's other communities that, again, that I'm less familiar with that aren't listed. But you get these 27, but I would say the two of those I just listed have a similar population and probably a similar footprint to those that you've listed elsewhere in the six. And so I guess that was part of one of the concerns I had. I didn't even get to the physical features I was going to ask on that next chart. But so how did you arrive at it? Was it just a legislative call out, or
No, there's a process that's outlined again in the technical appendix, and I'll ask Anna to jump in if I mischaracterize this. But when you look at the communities, there were obviously, I want to say over 100, and I can't remember if it was 120 small communities we looked at, but we looked at literally there's a list of named places. So we looked at communities that had a large population, and it was around 1,000 people that I think that we started looking at. We looked at the census tract information of what is a named community. And then literally from that list of over 100, we identified some of those small communities that were adjacent to an urban area or adjacent to another small community, because by providing protection to the urban area or that other small community, you get literally a twofer.
okay? So Freeport would get protection if the city of Sacramento got
Correct.
protection. That would
Right.
be assumed, and Locke would
Locke
get
would
protection
probably be
if
with
Walnut Grove got
yeah.
protection, even though they're separated by the cross channel. Yes, they are. Delta Cross Channel separates those two communities. They're not.
Yeah, that's why I went to Cortland further upstream, is you could literally, when you think of protecting the communities from this highest level space, you look at literally what is that flood basin or impact area.
Okay.
And if flooding can hit both communities from the same source, that's really where you're going to take your first focus. Now, the key to keep in mind, your earlier question was, if they're not listed by name in the plan, are they off the list? The answer is no. And the key is this was to come up with the cost estimates and to actually provide the justification for creating programs to actually start delivering money to the urban, the small communities, those rural communities, to implement those flood risk reduction projects. And naturally, when a program hits the street and is announced, the state does workshops to refine the guidelines, to inform people that they have an opportunity to come work with the state in development of those projects. So anybody could come in, and at that point where we start seeing a community that could actually be expanded to get really what I call that twofer, that's where the state would enter into a dialogue with those communities, say, we think a modification on this might result in a stronger benefit.
Yeah,
And
sorry.
Go ahead.
Like, for example, Locke, it's a part of the economic damage analysis, so we do consider that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Ms. Gray, did you have another question?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, we have three people. Don, did you get your?
Well, he didn't get a chance to finish his presentation. That was.
But you've got some questions on some of the charts we haven't seen. Why don't you ask ones you think are?
Well, I did. The one
Oh,
was
you did?
on the small
Okay.
communities, as I was going to ask about. I just didn't. Okay. He didn't get a chance to finish his presentation.
Can I just say this?
Yes.
I know there's a difference in terms of the protection, urban versus small communities, and I think you said it was based on legislation. But are you also saying that some of the small communities will have a second level of protection because of where they're near some of the 200-year protection areas or cities? I guess my concern is equal protection for all, because each of them are populated. Of course, it's a difference in population, but people are people. So is the idea to make you look at the entire area and try to provide protection as you can based on the funding and based on the legislation?
Well, this is where the risk discussion gets in when you start talking the legacy of a 200-year level protection or even a 100-year level protection was something that was measurable and could become literally a design standard to reduce the risk in an area. And one of the things, when we talk about the small communities in the plan, we talk about 100-year level protection. It's really federal policy, and it's really insurance. It's FEMA's the National Flood Insurance Program, that if a community were to fall out of 100-year flood protection and into a 99-year flood protection, from an actual risk point of view, there's no real difference sitting there. It's a percentage on a probability, but the depths of the water that would be hitting that small community and the actual footprint of where that water would go, so the height of the water and the footprint, would be fairly similar between those two levels. So from a risk point and from an economic standpoint, it's pretty close. But the difference is when you get into the benefit or the loss of eligibility for flood insurance, there's a taking to that community. So therefore, due to federal policy, we've advocated that there needs to be a 100-year level flood protection for the small communities to reduce that actual taking or significance of that. So one of the things that could be done is a dialogue with FEMA and the federal government on moving from level protection-based flood management activities to risk-based management activities. And the point of moving to risk-based management activities is there's finite capital, finite money, finite resources to address flood issues. And you can better prioritize your investment decisions by talking about real changes, really reductions in that risk.
And the fifth draft, our fifth draft Delta plan has language with regard to that shift in, what do you say, approach, conceptual planning, whatever it is. Yeah, it's a big deal nationally. It's very controversial, but it's a national trend.
I'll add in the plan, we actually talk about the annual exceedance probabilities in parens to the 100 years. And what we're trying to do is hopefully do a little better job of switching the mindset in the next 50 years to thinking about things of a 1 in 4 chance or a 1 in 10 chance, which I believe the public can communicate. So it strengthens our risk awareness programs and really stronger decision making on the part of the locals themselves, the individuals who are actually living with the risk.
Great.
But that's going to take generations to do. Just like we had a movement when I was a child to move into the SI system, and we moved right back to the English system. So I speak a little bit of both languages, but I'm getting rusty in my SI.
Thank you.
Done.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, then if I could just maybe ask Mike to jump ahead on one of the slides, because if you just take a moment, because I thought it was important in light of it, it really focused on the Delta, and that was the kind of the risk assessment that you had and the Delta levies, which was, yeah, keep going. I mean, actually, it's a few more slides ahead. I don't know if you were going to try to run through the rest of those, but that one and the next slide. If you could just take a moment and kind of tell us what you, one, charted out there, and then secondly, obviously, the next slide that follows on to that is just shows the levies that are maintained either in the state system and or what are defined, I guess.
Sure.
What page number is the chart you're looking at, please?
12.
Okay.
Slide 12.
Members, you've got copies of the slides in front of you, and I think that, well, some have page numbers, others don't have page numbers. Is it? Okay.
Left-hand corner are usually most of them.
Yeah, they're down here in this corner by that.
That's it.
Yeah, not all the content slides have the page numbers either.
Okay, new rule, future presentations, all slide presentations are numbered so we can follow the damn things. Except for the Mr. Machado's slides. There are 51 in total without numbers, but we'll get to those. We'll get to those. Okay, this is slide number 12 on the department's presentation.
Okay, so this map that we're looking at is a focus just on the Delta. And there's really three things or highlighted features I want to point out here. And the first is the gray areas that we're looking at are what we call an HEC flood damage assessment, FDA impact area. So literally anything, sorry, it's not the gray, it's the gray and the tan hatch. So in the handouts, it's a little clearer to see than on the screen there. But the bottom line is everything that's gray was what we call an impact area. This would be a flood basin that was in a riverine area where we used a different model, an HEC RAS model, to account for what the water that was reaching that area and getting into the floodplain would be in the depths. The tan hatched areas, so all of the tan areas represent an island that was represented in the RMA estuary model, which is a multidimensional model that allows us to account for the coincident tidal conditions in addition to the flood riverine flows. We used 1997 flood flows, which was the flood of record for many but not all locations in the Delta. But I'll add the caveat that difference between a 97 flood, an 86 flood, and a 55 flood is measured in inches in the Delta between those peaks. So the 97 was appropriate boundary because it actually put maximum backwater coming in from the estuary. But the whole Delta was treated from a hydraulic standpoint. And then the FDA model was extended to the estuary model reaches where there was a state plan of flood control facility protecting an island. And the whole island would be treated if part of the island had a state plan of flood control facility on it, from the same standpoint that in order to achieve the benefits of that state plan of flood control levy, you have to look at the whole unit that could be damaged. So I'll call attention on the western end of Sherman Island there. Part of Sherman Island has state plan of flood control levies on the Sacramento River. It does not on the San Joaquin, but we consider the analysis for the whole island of what would happen from flooding from either side, because in order to get the benefits for an improvement on the Sacramento side, you have to show that you're not getting wet from the back door. So that's what this graphic's telling you. And so it was a combination of riverine coupled with estuary models and then economic flood damage assessment models. And what the flood damage assessment model does, this is when Anna provided the number of what the annual expected damages are. It does what we call a Monte Carlo process. It samples the entire range of possible hydrologies from a statistical standpoint and then throws out what the damages are associated with that water height that would come from a possibility that there would be a breach or inundation in that area. So the model goes through thousands, it's actually 10,000 plus computations to actually generate out what this actual expected damage would be. And so the way to think of that traditionally is that expected damage is sort of equivalent to the annual average damages you would see if you took what we might get in the future for all of those discrete flood events once every 5 to 10 years.
Mike, one of the criticisms that I hear, something from a local perspective, but maybe from other courts as well, is that the models don't take into account a flood fight scenario. That you got system operations and you build in your ability, your capabilities of your structural viability and what's known. But did any of your models take into account that people actually do, certainly in the Delta, when the time is now, they do flood fight, and it doesn't mean that you can't still have bad things happen. But the models always, at least some of the federal guidelines, they hold that those levees are going to hold to the nth degree, and that you wouldn't do anything, something else wouldn't give somewhere else, and so you inundate the entire island up to 18, 20 feet, which physically you just know that's not going to happen. That's not how floods roll out. And so did your models account for any of that, or is it just that strict, put it in the computer and everything holds all the way up and down the river system, and when something gives, then that inundates that entire island. So I'm curious about...
The answer is the unpleasant one. We did both. And the answer is, when we go through, the whole purpose of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan was to come out with the billions of dollars that would be needed by the state, the people of California, literally to invest in reducing flood risk in the Central Valley. So we were really trying to be conservative in our estimate, meaning we were trying to actually have higher costs associated with this because we didn't want to have a shortfall in money. If we had said, we could address all the flood problems in the Central Valley for $1 billion, there would probably be people passing around the hat and putting money in there to reduce that risk. And so when you go through and do a project design versus an economic feasibility, how you treat the levee performance upstream, downstream, and at the point of location is very different. When you go through in a feasibility study, you're economically conservative, fiscally conservative. So you want to actually bring as much water to your point of interest. So in that point, you actually have what we would call a probability of failure that's put into your model for the upstream levee performance. What we did for the water traveling down in all of our technical analyses, we looked at what the outflow from the delta would be. That's the whole system is coming out there, and came up with numbers that are based off of what historically we've seen there for estimates of what the 100-year outflow would be at the delta. We looked at the number of levee failures that we would have for literally changing the probability on a height curve. So we have this term called a fragility curve. It talks about as the water rises on a level, as the water rises on a levee, what is the probability of failure of each individual levee? And as we went through, you can optimize. You could have all the levees fail when you're at the toe of the levee. You could have all the levees over top. We ended up finding that for the system model to match what were reasonable break locations and heights and outflow conditions, that an 85% probability point failure, and this is outlined in the technical appendices, was needed. The comprehensive study that was done in the 2000s considered a 50% probability of failure. which meant that when they would go through, their levees would fail at a lower elevation, meaning there would be less water coming downstream, which means the cost estimates that would come out of that type of analysis would be lower because you wouldn't need to actually design to a higher water surface at the point of location or mitigate for that higher water surface elevation out there. So we intentionally put in a higher level. Now that probability of failure, you could bump that probability of failure up if you wanted to account for a flood fight. And the fragility curve itself is based off of a geotechnical evaluation. And there were two types that were used for the development of this information. There was an actual urban levee evaluation program, and this is what the department has also been working on since 2007, where we've literally drilled thousands of holes in urban levees, taken the core samples out, and then from a geotechnical standpoint talked about what is that levee sitting on, what is its cross-section looking like, how safe is safe, how will it perform in the flood. And so that's a very robust model that was used to really shape what that curve would be like. In the non-urban areas, the geotechnical engineers didn't drill through the levees. They literally walked on the land side, the water side, the crest of the levee, and then took into consideration what is the design water surface elevation for that location, what is the 100-year water surface elevation, and then talked about what is the historical performance of that particular levee segment or that small reach of levee anywhere in the system has been, relative to what does it look like it's going to perform at. And those two factors came up with literally a performance curve for different failure modes. And then we aggregated those failure modes together to come out with an overall performance curve. And so individual geotechnical engineers would take into consideration, well, the levee's not going to really fail at this height, at this level, because someone is going to come in and flood fight. So this is where that element comes in. When you get into the non-urban areas, it was a team effort of department, Army Corps, consulting engineers, and these consulting engineers represent the local districts, work together for years literally to come through and assess what are the probability of failures on these levees. Now, when we went through and improved a levee, we actually treated it to the top of we treated the water to go to the top of the levee. So we took out, if we did a fix in the city of Marysville because it needed a 200-year level of protection, well, it makes sense from an economic standpoint that we're going to build a structure that's built to last and it's going to sit around for a while and perform really well at first. So we actually treated that levee's not going to fail because we've theoretically addressed all the deficiencies based on our new criteria. And so when we would go through in a small community and put in a new levee, the same logic would apply, that we would actually bring that performance at that individual location up to 100%. So there's a mix that's described in the plan. And so flood fight comes into consideration at points, and at other points it doesn't. And it's really, what are you trying to capture? When you go through and do your actual project design, you would look at a different set of assumptions.
Okay. And if I could just give Mr. The next chart, your
Page
next,
13.
Yeah, your next slide.
Okay.
If you just again.
Yeah, this is a pretty quick one, and this is just information to provide some context for State Plan of Flood Control Facilities. So these are not all project levees. These are the project levees that were outlined in the 2007 legislation. But to put it in context, within the Delta levees, and the plan talks about it, there are 315 miles of State Plan of Flood Control, and it's not showing up on the slide. I didn't write the word in there. It should be, those are, State Plan of Flood Control levees. And then 715 miles of non-State Plan of Flood Control levees. So 70% of the levees in the Delta are not State Plan of Flood Control.
Yeah, this is a very important graphic chart because it helps us explain the the territorial coverage of your eventual plan and, the parts in our planning area which aren't included.
And I wanted to, the next two slides really provide the context. And this is the part I really wanted to talk about because I get these questions on a frequent basis from reporters, from locals, from other engineers. And the history of why the levee was State Plan of Flood Control or not really goes back to the 1955-1957 assurance agreements that the state provided to the federal government. The levees were in existence prior to that time. There was literally a benefit assessment that was performed back in the 1950s of what the state was willing to assume to a higher level of responsibility and authority, and then actually answer up to the federal government, and that the federal government also recognized that there was a federal interest in incorporating this into a federal facility. This process the state of California did in the 50s is similar to what's happened nationwide, where there are project levies nationwide and there are non-project levies. And the Army Corps cooperates with local agencies on both, but to different degrees. So one of the questions people ask is, well, can I get my levy added to state plan flood control? And so before I talk about whether you should or you should not, and that's something that you would want to go through and repeat the decision process that was done in the 1950s to see you can also remove facilities from the state plan of flood control. Is there a reason for us to keep that in there? And the federal government is open to both. But the process for adding is, if it's a federal project that has been authorized, once construction is completed, that facility can be turned over to state. When it's turned over to the state, the only way we'll do that is if the state provides an assurance agreement that says we will continue to operate and maintain this facility to whatever your future standards will be. And I highlight whatever your future standards will be, because that's a little bit of an uncertainty that you're putting out there as a state or a local to assuming that federal project. The next line are the state-led early implementation program projects. So after we got the bond money and the locals had projects that were ready to roll, we wanted to actually move quickly because there was risk exposure in these urban areas. Is the state paid for these? We got the federal credit. We had federal authorization because these were improvements to federal facilities already. But we wanted to enter into an updated agreement with the federal government to go through and do this. Now, in some cases, there might have been some segments of levees that weren't state plan of flood control, and you could use the justification that you've improved this basin to add it in there. And I'll get into that slide a couple further down the road. And the last one is local projects that were constructed. They can use the Flood Control Act of 1970 actually as a starting point to get into a discussion both with the state and the federal government to demonstrate what are the state benefits for assuming and adding this facility to state plan flood control. And there would be a parallel discussion with the federal government. And in both cases, you would seek authorization and project agreements similar to what you would do in the previous two cases. But the key is as you go through this is a dialogue, and each party has to sit at the table, and really you have to demonstrate what the pros and cons are, which are really what I put together is the next slide. And this is a high level. This is, I say, examples of pros and cons of having a state plan of flood control facility. It's not an all-inclusive list. But from a high level, there's a federal feasibility or justification process. There are the levy design standards, and there's a permitting process. And so I'll go through and read the table and the pros. From a feasibility justification process, the standardized assumptions and tools that are used in the benefit cost assessments, when you go through that, it's a little bit easier to pull an off-the-shelf justification and point to another federal project in the same area. It makes it easier to go through that economic justification when you're in a state plan of flood control facility, because there's a level of familiarity with the tools, the assumptions, the area that those federal engineers that are going to be and planners are going to be working with you can use to justify the project. The con side, there's going to be a greater local cost share for the project improvements. You're now having to participate with the Army Corps of Engineers to go through and make improvements on your project, to make repairs on your project. That's time spent going through and doing that. You're going to have to spend more time demonstrating to a federal standard and a federal method and format of what your benefits are that are associated there. And so that's an important consideration just to get started. And then there's a longer time frame to move from the concept to construction, where it does take, as Joe was pointing out, decades, if not, you said 4 decades in some cases, to move down that path. And that's something that the federal government is looking to find a way to streamline. But you have to be realistic that the more pots of money that are paying for something, the more accountability that comes into play, the longer it's going to take. At the design level standards, when you move to a federal design level standard, there are just more engineers who understand the basic design, so they're going to be up to speed and can actually apply that when you actually get to the actual construction process. There are also higher performance standards that are associated and higher factors of safety, because you have to use approved methods, approved standards that have gone through that rigorous proof. So what you're getting out of that is a levy that is going to have a higher performance level. The cons, the basic designs do not take into account the unique hazards and needs of estuaries such as the Delta. And I say estuaries such as the Delta because there's estuaries throughout the United States, and there's different considerations that come into what we would call a constantly loaded levee, or a levee that basically has different risks associated with it, different material that can be used in those levees. Those types of considerations are less detailed when you get into the federal design standards. There's also greater costs associated with the higher performance standards. So you get higher performance, but there's a greater cost. You're literally building a more robust structure, but you might be over-designing your structure. And that's one of the considerations that you need to get into and consider. And then finally, at the permitting process, there's additional opportunity, I use the word opportunity, to assess the risk transfer and public comment. So that means the stakeholders, the externalities, the other people who are impacted by a project improvement have a say in what your upstream improvement's doing there. So in the Delta, this means if a Delta levee that's not state plan flood control becomes state plan flood control, now the city of San Francisco, the city of Oakland would have a legal right to actually be engaged in that feasibility process and actually ask to see your hydraulic impact analysis of what you've done to change water levels in the bay. How are you going to mitigate for your improvement here? And it comes down to the analogy of a butterfly flaps its wings. Well, somebody still has to go through and do at least some sort of finding to just demonstrate what that is. Now, we're working parallel in the department to provide some guidance on what is a non-significant impact to really streamline that for the state side and the Title 23 analysis that the Central Valley Flood Protection Board requires, and also to provide some better guidance or suggestions to the federal government on how the Corps' 408 hydraulic impact analysis can work. But right now, there are a lot of costs and a lot of uncertainties associated with that because the federal government has been changing that. So I've moved right into the cons, is the time and cost for the additional permitting result in significant increases in the overall project design costs, where you can move in some areas from a 20% to a 40% soft cost. And anytime you're going through and doing an improvement on a federal facility, you need a federal reauthorization for any improvement. If you're increasing the height, this is now an act of Congress. So you're not working just with your normal political groups here in the state of California. You're now having to talk to not only your California delegation, but when you talk about change to a federal facility, taxpayers in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, New York State, they all have a vote and a say in what you're doing. So their senators and representatives are also going to be equally interested in your project-specific details. So I think there's some sound advice for both. So I'm going to go to the next slide here.
Mr. Chair, Mike, just before you leave it, because it goes to one of the questions that I had. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but on your cons and your basic design standards and so forth, I know you spent a good deal of time in the plan talking about 8499 and staying eligible for those funds, but the whole thing with the vegetation policy. You talk about design standards just on the profiles and strength and seismic activity, but that presents certainly in the Delta, but elsewhere. I think you've outlined that as elsewhere in the overall Central Valley. What that means certainly to your habitat and your other permitted agencies, but just the standpoint of Delta and what people can speak, and yet if you qualify for these dollars, how do you? And I don't buy the variance process. We've gone through that with Safeco. Yeah, it can work, but a great amount of expense in engineering, and then you only get part of what you're looking for anyway. So it seems to me that in addition to design standards, that vegetation policy is going to one size fits all, and I know the Corps is still looking at it, but if there isn't some consideration for California, and particularly the Delta, then I think that presents a big, big hurdle to what we're trying to achieve, certainly with the co-equal goals and Delta as a place. That's pretty monumental in my view, is that if people make that stick.
Oh, no, I agree, and you can kind of follow the headlines to read between the lines where the state feels on that position.
Right.
In this table here, under the federal levee design standards, I listed the periodic Army Corps of Engineers inspection program. When you become part of the federal process, you become part of the federal annual inspection program. That program typically nationwide has a 5-year cycle of going through the periodic inspections to reassess how you meet the current standards. So if the standard changes, so if suddenly vegetation is an issue and the federal government doesn't want vegetation on levees in the United States, you could be asked through that inspection, you could be listed as having non-acceptable criteria. So they would call it minimally acceptable or unacceptable criteria, which could impact your ability to get improvements to the project or even your rehabilitation assistance. Now, It's important to note in the context of Delta that there's a PL 8499 Rehabilitation Assistance Program, which says that if there's damage during an actual declared high water event that's measurable, that you have to then demonstrate that there's a benefit cost ratio that's beneficial to the federal government, for the federal government to come in on a new cost share that's negotiated to get rehabilitation just for your levee. It doesn't pay for the damaged areas behind that. FEMA will pay for that if there's a presidential declared disaster, and people mix that up. Then there's also a, in the Delta, and this applies nationwide, the PL 8499 program. Then there's also, in the Delta, a PL 8499 Delta-specific design standard that is not part of the state plan of flood control. That's another agreement where I would prefer to let other engineers from our Delta levees and subventions programs get into the details of what's sitting out there, because they deal with this particular standard on a daily basis.
We'll hear more about that this afternoon in
We
the
will.
presentation. But I just wanted to touch on that, because I mean we talk about it, and the other thing with the mitigating for all the downstream or potential upstream impacts. Glad to hear there may be some accommodation for some impacts, because you have to go from the tip of the Sierras all the way to the Pacific Ocean in your mitigation considerations. Not that doesn't look at the environmental process, and then require an act of Congress on top of it becomes pretty burdensome.
Right. I think one of the tools that's sitting out here is we go through, and I mean really the Department of Water Resources, and use our system-wide model and our system-wide tool to talk about a base condition and then a proposed system-wide investment condition. You can look at really how far were the downstream extents from that collective set of high-level actions, where were the no downstream impacts felt or seen. And then a project proponent could use that as the basis to advocate, I really don't think I need to chase my water down to the Golden Gate, because when we changed everything in the Sacramento-San Joaquin valleys, as proposed by this study, they weren't seeing the impacts even get into the Delta. And so I'll close with that on the bubble slide of where you're seeing those impacts. And it's because we are talking about attenuating the flood flows in the bypasses. Literally, as we widen those bypasses, allow more flows to come in there, we're reducing those water levels and those heights. And with the reduced heights, we also slow down literally the velocities traveling those waters.
Why don't you change to that slide so everyone can see it?
So I'm going to skip over this one. I want to get back to this, which is an example on that. This is the slide I'm referring to here. So going back to the bubble of the benefits here, I've just added at a high level a plus for when we go through and talk about achieving the state plan of flood control design capacity by raising and restoring the levees just to what their design height was in 55, 57, relative to today's baseline conditions, meaning 2010, you would see increases in the water levels in the Delta. Now, those increases would still be fairly minor, meaning, between inches and a half foot, and that's because when you get to the estuary, there is a lot of accommodation and space for the floods literally to go. And you see this when you look at the stage frequency diagrams out there. I mean, the estuary literally is getting into those high water conditions twice a day. Now, the next two approaches, the protect high-risk communities and the state system-wide investment approach, they're fairly neutral in their impacts, meaning there's really no measurable impact in the Delta. The reason I'm saying that is when you think about the protect high-risk communities, we have not improved in that particular approach the levees in the rural agricultural areas. Therefore, you're going to continue to have frequent flooding in those areas. And it's really going to be a redirected transfer from what happens in the urban area to the ag area, which is one of the reasons we did not promote that approach. In the state system-wide investment approach, the price tag goes up because we're putting in those system-wide elements literally to accommodate those flood flows and to account for what those improvements, what that redirected transfer would be. We're accommodating that by reducing that peak flow, attenuating it in the bypass system. So that's why it's really a no change in the Delta. And then finally, for the enhanced flood system capacity approach, that's a decrease across the system, because in addition to going after the bypasses, that approach does consider going through and getting additional storage increasement upstream. So we're literally reducing, getting that third foundational area I talked about, reducing those peak flows. But the reality is right now, we don't have the financing, we really don't have the financing to get $30 billion or $40 billion, and we don't have the capacity at the state or even the federal level to spend that money on a timely basis in the 35 to 40 year period that I talked about. Now, if we get money in 5 years from now, the Simplified Flood Protection Plan goes through a 5-year update cycle. There's no reason that we can't begin to pull more elements from that enhanced flood system capacity approach in there. and really work to achieving that. So that really becomes the future goal and direction we need to go through and address. But in the here and now, we need the 14 to 17 billion that we've advocated in the state system-wide investment approach, where we're talking about implementation timeframes of 25 to 30 years, with the system elements, the bypass improvements, being those decade-long improvements. And we really do want to lean more towards increasing the speed at which we can jump from feasibility into that project-specific design for those rural, small community, and urban improvements.
All right.
I mean, you've seen the other slides. I'll just briefly say the Stockton slide. I put that up there as an area where the department has been having conversations with SJAFCA. And it's hard to see in the graphic, but if you look at your handouts, you'll notice that there are a mix of state plan of flood control and non-state plan of flood control levees that are protecting the same urban areas. And since there is an urban 200-year level of protection requirement, it makes sense for us really to get them into the same system and process, literally to keep people talking on the same language or the same dictionary, because there's a lot of confusion that comes from having different standards.
Can you describe to me what the colored section of the map actually refers to?
The grayed out sections on the map represent where there's urban populations. That's Lodi, Stockton.
Okay.
You're
All right.
seeing the tail end of Sacramento.
All right.
And then the red lines are the state plan of flood control levees, and the yellow lines are all of the non-state plan of flood control levees that are out there. So if I can have some, did you have more questions, or can I have closing?
No, I
quick?
think we are wrapping up.
Okay, so if I could do three closing, is the state system-wide investment approach did not directly cover the entire legal delta, but focused really on the improvements of the state plan of flood control facilities, the legislated elements, and system-wide improvements. However, the technical analysis in the Simplified Flood Protection Plan and the cost estimates associated with the state system-wide investment approach recommendations, not the other approaches, did consider the impacts of the delta, specifically through the costs and benefits achieved through the system-wide improvements, which benefit the delta as well as the soft costs, the contingency costs, and the mitigation costs associated with the upstream improvements to the state plan of flood control project facility improvements and the related non-state plan of flood control project improvements.
Did